Good afternoon, everyone. Today, Caleb and I are going to be discussing a very hot topic right now in the news, as always, gun control and gun rights, and how the two play off against each other, and where the balance is. If there is a balance to be had, who knows? So without further ado, we are going to jump right into this very interesting topic. So, Caleb, any thoughts or commentary right off the top?
Well, I mean, what a time to be talking about this, that's for sure. Because I feel like after that recent shooting in the elementary school in was Texas, right?
At
And
Uvalde, yeah, was that in Texas? I don't know where it was. The
yes,
Uvalde school, yeah.
it just seems like the news has almost brought that back up into their priorities. And you keep seeing shooting here, shooting there. And especially within America, we think, oh my God, like, is this month have just had a lot of shootings? No, there was one really bad shooting in a really bad place to have a shooting, which is with little children. And the news is using that now to emphasize every other shooting, but that always happens. They're just now trying to push that agenda, which is unfortunate that they don't commentate on shootings all the time like this, but they're happening all the time. And especially in America, they have like, you're more likely to die from a shooting from things like, I can't even remember, but I was reading online, some of the things that you would expect would have a higher mortality rate than shootings don't. So that's my biggest worry right now is how safe is it really to live in the land of the free, you know?
Yeah, no, that's it's like Chicago, for instance. You make me think of Chicago because you hear there's some stats out there if you Google, if anyone wants to Google some stats, but Chicago shootings, like over the course of any given weekend, sometimes, they don't always end up in deaths. Sometimes it's injuries, but the number of people who are injured or killed in gun violence over the course of an average weekend in Chicago is like, 5 or 6 or 7, like per weekend. Like it's just a lot. It's a lot of human life, a lot of suffering.
Yeah, and to reel that back into Victoria in a sense, Chicago, they went, I think it was 4 or 5 days without a single shooting, and it was celebrated. In Victoria, we can go 4 or 5 years without,
Years.
like,
Yeah,
without a death by stabbing.
that's right.
Like, it is really sad, and it does really make you think. Because since this is a conversation about gun control, what's the difference between Chicago and a big city in Canada like Vancouver? Maybe Victoria is too small, but let's go to Vancouver next door. How come Vancouver doesn't have shootings every day? And we say we have gun laws, and some people argue the other side too. But you could argue that the proof is in the pudding, because we did have a bad shooting in Canada one time in the Polytechnic School in Montreal, I want to say, in the late 80s. And I'm sure most people are aware of this. And after that, you see the rules now, and they've prohibited assault rifles, sawed-off shotguns, and anything that's automatic. So it doesn't have to be an assault rifle. Something like an Uzi, and for anyone who's not aware of what Uzi is, it's just almost the size of a pistol, a little bit bigger, but it shoots like an AK-47. So it shoots like an assault rifle that's automatic. Anything like that has been banned. You can only get handguns and guns that could be used for hunting. Essentially, anything that's used to kill people, any device of war, I guess you could call it, is prohibited from public use mainly. And to get the other guns, it's really hard. In America, on the other hand, all of these guns and some things that you wouldn't even understand why a human would want to have in their house, because it's like, even to protect yourself, that's too much. Like, you'll go to some states with really restricted gun laws, and people will have like turret machine guns. And you think, what could be the possible use for that? Like, even if someone was to invade your house, how are you going to operate that gun?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah.
No, I laugh because I picture some guy running out in his pajamas, to get on the turret gun and just start like,
Yeah, like I'm thinking it's
but
Arnold Schwarzenegger or Bruce
yeah,
Willis movie. Yeah.
yeah. Well, America has a strong movie culture, right? I mean, and movies are so pervasive. And I would say largely because of Netflix and the fact that so many of us spend a lot of time at home after work or on our own. I mean, 30% of Canadians live on their own, right? Something like at least 30% or 36%. So, we spend a lot of time with movies, and movies kind of shape our ideas about the world. And I think maybe for some folks, they do sort of live in sort of that realm in their heads that's sort of bad guys around every corner, home invasions, have all that, military grade weaponry ready to go. I don't want to insult those people because, like I laugh, but at the same time, like I do understand sort of the mentality in the sense that, the expression, a man's home is his castle, and you should be able to defend it. And, there have been some very dark and disturbing home invasions, over the years. You can read some of the stories. And, I got on one of those true crime kicks a while back, and I was reading about some of these home invasions, and they are horrific. And to think that if someone had the ability to shoot and kill or maim or scare off those would-be attackers, that is, that's worth something, right?
Yeah. And I think where I go to think about that is, well, if I lived in South Central LA or inner city Chicago or somewhere like that, Brooklyn, New York, the Bronx, would I have a gun in my house to protect my family? And the honest answer is absolutely. Because for me personally, and that's only because everyone else has them. So I might as well, I can't just sit here being the social justice warrior saying no guns, and then end up dying by a gunfight. But in Canada, in Victoria particularly, I've never had to worry about that issue. And I'm not saying it's not possible that a gun could be handy one day. But if the other person trying to attack you theoretically doesn't have one, then it takes out a lot of your stress of why you would need one too. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. There's two things I want to say here. I'm just curious which one to go with first. Let's go with the Japan and assassination of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. So, in that case, let's say, you don't, because Japan apparently has very restrictive gun laws. In fact, no private citizens are allowed to own handguns. I was just reading. And so, let's say here in Victoria and in Canada, up until now, I think we're going to see a change over the next decade, we're in terms of the proliferation of guns on the streets potentially. But up until now, it's like we've been kind of like a gun-free country, I would say. And Victoria definitely feels like kind of a gun-free city. But what if someone uses a homemade gun or a ghost gun to kind of get that edge? Then like, how does that play into your thoughts on that part there?
Well, I think we should start with directly looking at Shinzo Abe's situation, which is very unfortunate. Just to say, the man was outstanding in his work and what he's done as just being a leader for that long time, longest leader of Japan in their democratic era. And it's unfortunate, but if we're gonna look at the situation itself, it's amazing, and it probably shocks a lot of the people in Japan too, because they're not used to gun violence in general. So for the most famous, arguably, leader in modern history for Japan to be killed by gun violence, that's a culture shock. And the gun itself, like you said, it was like a pipe and wood and electrical tape, the actual structure of the gun. But I start to wonder, does that make any excuse to why gun laws and gun restriction doesn't work? Because just because someone is going to try to find another way around it, does that mean we have to just let all hell loose? Pardon my French for some people, but it is thought-provoking, but I don't see why that might add to that argument, even from a nonpartisan side. I don't think that's a good argument, in my opinion, just for that reason. Just because you think that other people will find another way, well, okay, let's say you ban homemade guns and you make sure there's no duct tape and there's no wood in the world. Well, someone has a kitchen knife. Okay, so are you going to ban kitchen knives? Well, someone has a spoon and a fork. You could kill someone with a spoon. I could kill someone with a pen, theoretically. But if something is made specifically to kill a person, like an AK-47 has no other objective than to kill a human being, that's a big difference from a homemade gun, in my opinion.
Those are fair points. And my wife, she made the point that kind of stuck with me. It's that, no law is perfect at the end of the day. It's sort of, let's say it gets 80% of what it accomplishes, 80% of what it's trying to accomplish. No law is going to accomplish 100%, right? So, I think there's some truth in that, some fairness to that. To your point that assault rifles can only, or AK-47 can only be used to kill or injure someone, there are folks, I just want to make sure that all voices are heard, sort of, and it's just your and I voice here. So I was talking with someone, a gun advocate last week, and people who are sort of very pro gun, and from a recreational hobby standpoint, like some guys, like some people like cars, some people like dogs, the things that we collect or put our time and energy and resources into. And for some people that's guns. So I personally would never see why I would need an assault rifle or an AK-47, and it's hard to justify. That one for me is hard to justify. But just for the sake of argument, is it fair to say that maybe for recreational purposes we could allow, or that we should allow? I mean, here in Canada, I don't think we are allowing any of those, but let's say in the United States, because they are so close, should there be some allowance for recreational activities for some of these higher powered guns?
I think it's very circumstantial, in the sense that I don't see a problem with guns being used in a gun range that is very highly protected, highly secure, and has a lot of protocol to be allowing a person to use the gun. Like, they have to have a license and this and that. And then the guns will be at the range. They're not your guns. Like a scenario like that, a concept of that sort. I don't know if they're still operating like that in Canada, but there were some places even not far from Victoria where you could do certain things like that with automatic weapons, or at least semi-automatic weapons. But another part of that was what you were saying, is some people like to collect guns. And I get it, it's fair. Like, most people who have guns aren't going to do something horrible with the guns. And that is a fact. And it's just like most people who drive won't get into a drunk driving accident, but it happens a lot. But here's my thing. I'm a car guy. That's one of my passions. I love cars. I have a cooler vintage BMW from the early 2000s. And if someone told me that I need to give that BMW up as law, like if all cars had to go electric to save the planet, which is something that is coming up close, I wouldn't particularly like it, because I love that car like it's my baby. But especially as someone who's very politically aware, I realize how much that is of an importance to not only myself, but my future family generations. Forget everyone else, how much that helps me. And I think a great example of that was, her name was it Gabby Gifford? The lady the American
That's right.
politician who got shot.
Democrat politician who was shot. Yeah.
Yeah, and she was, before she was shot, she wasn't as strong on advocating for gun restrictions. But as soon as it affected her life, then everything started to change. She was more on the side of gun control. She was stronger on advocating for it. And I'm not trying to look at it as an insensitive human being saying, oh, it takes someone to get shot to understand. But I'm saying it's interesting how once it happens, you understand. Why did her opinion change now that she got shot? Because it was her? I think that's kind of selfish. If that was her pure motive for changing her opinion, because someone else got shot the other day, but because she has a security intel and all that, she's protected, but not as protected as she thought.
I mean, one of the problems is, as far as I see it, just to kind of backtrack a little bit too, but also to build on this point, is, quote unquote criminals or people with ill intentions or malintent, they're not necessarily looking to take the firearms safety course. They're not looking to register their guns. They're just getting their guns. I read an article in the Guardian, actually, that was talking about guns being sent by drone across the Detroit River, I believe it, or somehow from Michigan State into Ontario, in like a shopping bag, basically, by drone, right? And so there are so many, because our southern neighbor has so many guns there. It's more than one per person. There's like over 300 million firearms in the United States. Because of that, I feel like inherently we are going to see guns here, like a certain number that we wouldn't if we lived maybe, beside a different country that had less guns. And so, let's say criminal elements or people who, have an idea of what they want to do with a firearm, and it's something illegal, it can get guns that are illegal guns, pay cash, in some back alley, or buy it out of the trunk of someone's car. And then so how does that, because that's the part that I think gun enthusiasts and people who are gun owners get upset about is that, a lot of these laws and restrictions seem to be almost punitive towards law-abiding, respectful, responsible gun owners, and it does nothing to stop the criminal element of gun ownership. So how does that play in?
It's a hard one because I try to be as empathetic and sympathetic to people who own guns and use them for recreational purposes and stuff like that, and just gun enthusiasts, I guess is a good word to use, because I get it that guns can be fun. So it's like a sport in some cases for some people, but guns weren't built to be a sporting object. That's what I see. One thing, it's a weapon, and I'm not saying that it can't be used that way, but because it is technically a weapon, very much so actually a weapon, people are going to use it as weapons. And when the number of people who are dying because of those guns are so high, and they've tried for generations to find an avenue to change that issue, but the only times it seems to work in countries is when they just restrict them. As I said at the very beginning, the proof is in the pudding to me. I mean, if someone could come up with a situation or a scenario, a concept for legislation that would work and could be tested and seen to work, that without completely restricting guns, I would be all for it. I just haven't seen it yet. So it's like the argument with Obamacare. A lot of people say Obamacare is not perfect. Obamacare, there's better out there. Well, yeah, sure. No one agrees with it's perfect. I don't think Barack Obama himself agrees that Obamacare is perfect, but when you bring something better, then change it. But until that day, don't take away something that is useful for now. If you have some, instead of arguing why this is not perfect, just bring something better. And if you can't, then that's probably why that's a good argument for people to say it's the best option.
Well, and I'm not saying, or entertaining the idea that we don't have any laws or restrictions.
Of course.
It's just as they seem to have been layered on. Like right now, something that's in the works, and this is the one that has sort of got people energized about this topic here in Canada, is it's effectively a handgun ban as it's being proposed. It's banning the sale and transfer of handguns, which pretty much bans handguns in a sense, right? Because you can't sell them or transfer them, and I think even purchasing them or something like that. So it kind of freezes handguns, and as I said, in Japan they have a strict handgun. Private citizens cannot own handguns. And one of the interesting things I just read in an article on that subject is that there are much more knife attacks as a result in Japan, and in fact there are mass knife attacks, as in as many as 19 people were killed in one knife massacre sort of. So I mean, knives can be dangerous too, right?
Well,
so, yeah, I'm just for me the big question is, to what degree do we restrict guns? And if we keep layering on restrictions for guns, does it end up helping the cause, or does it just sort of hurt the average responsible law-abiding gun owner?
that's a good point. Well, I want to look at it from at least two angles from my perspective, maybe three. The first is a psychological perspective, which is it's much easier for a coward to go around killing people with a gun than it is with a knife. And I know this argument isn't brought up very often, but I've seen a couple psychologists look at it this way. And I think you can make that argument very well. I don't even technically have to look at you when I shoot you with a gun if I'm point blank. But the act of stabbing someone is second to beating them to death, which is a much more gruesome, much more brute force action. And usually the cowards who kill people with guns are cowards. That's a much harder act for them to do. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it definitely changes the ratio a bit. And also think about it as a police officer, for example. If I'm a police officer and I know that the only thing people have out there, or at least the vast majority of them, is a knife, I feel a lot better, especially in a country in Canada where the police are allowed to have guns when civilians are not, the specific guns they have. If someone has a knife, yeah, they could hurt me, technically, but there's a much higher chance I see them coming from far away. I have a taser, I have a gun, I have a baton. Like, it's the fight is in your advantage. And then the other way I wanted to look at it was the actual context of the Second Amendment in America, which is the right to bear arms. That law wasn't built for people that enjoy guns. That's a valid argument. I'm not saying it isn't, but if you're really protecting the Second Amendment, it has nothing to do with that. And a lot of people say it does, but that's factually incorrect historically. And I can prove it. If anyone wants to look it up, they can fact check it. The Second Amendment is written specifically to protect American citizens from their own government, is one of the main things. Because let's say the government became corrupt and dictatorship-like, and it was a government like a fascist regime, like, I don't know, we can look at someone who we all agree on, like
Stalinist Russia or something.
Stalin Russia or Mussolini, whatever you like. Then in that situation, the American people have the right to bear arms to revolt against their government to protect America. Because the whole idea there is America and the government are not the same things. If the government isn't supporting American values, they are no longer America. That was written in a time where that was so much more likely to happen. That was written in a time when America was a new developing country, in a time where America had many enemies within the Western world, even like Britain and such. That was in a time where there was a lot of corruption in government, like at every level. And I'm not saying some of these things don't linger around today, but as we saw, even with Donald Trump, there is this whole January 6th thing. Some people argue that he was trying to overthrow his own government, but it was literally impossible. They tried, they got in, they were in the building, inside the rooms where all the governors sit, and they still couldn't do anything except make some noise and scare a few people. Because the government, American system is so strong that law is almost irrelevant to today's world. So why does it exist? If that is the truth, and that is the reason why that law is made, I can prove to you in so many different ways that that is irrelevant. That was one of the ways I just proved it right now. So I'm not even saying I might sound like a strong advocate for this right now, but I'm just trying to look at it from an argumentative standpoint. I'm looking at all of this, not by this side and this side. I'm looking at it as, okay, you have an argument. Are your premises even valid? And to me, it seems that on the gun advocacy side, I've seen a lot more shakiness in the arguments. And this is one of the main core areas where I see that.
Yeah, I mean, the Second Amendment is interesting. I'll post a link in the description. There's a conversation between Joe Rogan and one of his guests from a few years ago, and they talked about this, and that he actually pulled up the wording of the Second Amendment on the screen, and it specifically relates to a militia. A militia in the context of a militia, the people bearing arms, because at the time when the United States was kind of pulling away from the clutches of England. And if you read about the historical context at the time, where the English government that was stationing British soldiers, like forcibly stationing British soldiers in American homes, like they were required to accommodate these British soldiers and feed them, and and for no pay, and also the taxation issue and stuff, and there was. And so like the government was very much seen as separate from the people, right? Because the government at that time didn't represent the people. The British government didn't represent the American people. And I think that kind of carried over, because the people who wrote the American Constitution were living at that time and grew up in that time. So they could see that there was a distinction between the what the government wanted and how the government behaved, and the people and what the people wanted. And so it talks about a militia, and a private militia, sort of, if the people have the right to bear arms in the context of a militia to keep their government in check, and so they can't be oppressive and dictatorial and abuse their rights. So that's a piece of it. I think it's kind of it's related to that. But I do philosophically, I do agree with the idea that citizens should have a way to keep government in check. I just, you look at some of the incompetence and some of the corruption. on all political sides, I think I could find cases from left, right, socialist, communist, conservative, where rights have been abused,
Mhm.
so I think from a philosophical perspective, I fundamentally do believe that citizens should have a check on their government. And because this is one thing I learned in a poli-sci class a long time ago, and it stuck with me. I mean, this is like 15 years ago, but it stuck with me, is that the state has the monopoly of violence. The state
Yep.
has the monopoly on violence. So
Yep.
only the state has the power to use the military or deploy the military, as was seen in the War Measures Act, or during the FLQ crisis. And only the state has the power to like police force, like the municipal government represents the state at the municipal level, and so the police force has the monopoly of violence in our city. And as citizens, we surrender our say privilege or right to violence for the greater good, and kind of just say, here, government, you oversee this, you have the monopoly on violence here, but we need to be practical here and realistic. And I've seen so many instances throughout history where governments abuse their power. So then what do? If governments, during the Khmer Rouge era of Cambodia, I should research more on that before I make a comment on it. I think it was Pol Pot was the governor, but there are many examples of where governments have just run roughshod over their people. Nazi Germany is a good example. And one of the things I talked about recently with someone was there was that movie called Defiance with Daniel Craig, and it's about based on the true story of the Bielski brothers, and they held out in the forest with firearms, right? Because you can't just have sticks and stones. And they ultimately, I believe they were taken in, but they held out for a year or more. And and then on Facebook, I've seen several times over the last couple of years where there's a black and white photo of a young French woman, maybe in her late teens or her 20s, and she had been declared like a heroine, or she had killed some German Nazi officers when the Nazi government ruled France, and the French resistance was sort of the underground resistance against this Nazi installed French government, the Vichy government. And they're lauded as heroes. We hold these people up as heroes. And then the same with the Ukraine and Russia instance, where Ukrainian citizens were given assault rifles and rifles to defend their country, and that was applauded. So for me, like, I don't like contradictions and I don't like hypocrisy, and I find there is some hypocrisy amongst, I would say, more progressives in this aspect, where it's like, we don't want private citizens to have guns. I mean, my aunt the other day, we were in conversation actually a couple weeks ago, and she said, in her mind, really, the only people who should have firearms are the police and the military. The average citizens has no need for a gun. And I can see that argument. I really can. But to believe in that, you have to believe that government and the powers that be always have your best interests at heart and are always going to be there to take care of you fairly. And I don't believe that that's the case. In history, we've had a good run in Canada here for a long time. But let's say the Japanese during World War II, many of them were rounded up and sent to internment camps. And many of their children and babies died of typhoid. Many of them died of typhoid. We actually have quite a few Japanese people buried in our cemetery here in Victoria at the Ross Bay Cemetery. And you can see the dates on the headstones, and it corresponds to that internment era. So when your government turns on you, and you don't have any means to defend you need a means to defend yourself. So that's my argument there.
Since you brought that side, I'll counter it. I'm from Eritrea. We've talked about that in this podcast before. And long story short, Eritrea had a 30-year independence war. It's literally every single family has more than one person in that family that was a rebel in that war. Every single family lost at least one person in that war. Most families that I've met have lost at least two, at least. So the whole nation 30 years ago was at war against Ethiopia, which was the country that annexed Eritrea for 30 years. After that, the government that won, the rebels, became dictatorship. Complete, like it is, in my opinion, top 3 most tough dictatorships in the world. And I think a lot of people agree with me because they say it's the North Korea of Africa. The journalism's put it lower than North Korea in terms of journalism freedom. But the point here is, in that country, one of the worst dictatorships on earth, the dictator, the sole tyrant, whose name is Isaias Afwerki, gives every family an AK-47 after their child has finished their forced military conscription, which is supposed to be 2 years, but it can last like a lifetime. But anyways, every household is given a gun by the state. And that guy's power is so strong in the country, it hasn't even been contested in the last few years by anybody in the government. So the tyrant gave everyone guns. Literally, if everyone went outside, pointed their guns at the parliament building, they could probably overthrow it. But he's systematically taken over the country. You can't even speak about doing something like that to your neighbor, because your neighbor will tell the next neighbor. Within that street, one person is a quote unquote snitch, like they're a mole. He has locked down the whole country. So hypothetically, that doesn't work. Because why I say hypothetically it doesn't work is that's a case where it literally isn't working. And it hasn't worked. 30 years ago, Eritrea got its independence. This guy's been a dictator for 30 years. The population is going down. More people from the rebel country have left instead of putting up for a fight in a country where the whole country was at war at one time. So that is a good case for where that doesn't work, in my opinion. I'm sure there's so many cases where you could argue the other way, but I'm just saying even that is also not perfect, since most gun advocates try to talk about the imperfections. Well, there's an imperfection on that side too.
Well, just for the sake of argument, let me say 2 things there. So let's say every family has an AK-47. How much ammunition do they have? What kind of access to ammunition do they have? I mean, if you can only go, 1 clip or 2 clips, that's not enough to overthrow a government, right? So that's one piece. The other thing is that I'm talking about, say, Canada or the United States today. If a foreign power invaded, or if our own government turned on us, and maybe they decide tomorrow that French Canadians all need to be rounded up and sent to internment camps, or insert type hyphenated Canadian needs to go be rounded up or deported. Should those Canadians, maybe they have properties, they have homes, they have businesses. I mean, for me in Eritrea, throughout the war and stuff, that devastated probably the economy and the people. What was really there? Like, it probably was easier to leave and go abroad than to fight at home, right? Like, for me, I don't know. I feel like I would just, because if I knew that Europe existed or North America existed, why would I stay and try and fight for this place that has known war for a few decades and maybe doesn't have the same value in that sense?
But here's my question: why not? For example, because I say why not? Because if you fought against Ethiopia, against Haile Selassie, the most famous king, arguably in African history, one of the most famous kings in history and human history, especially because he was one of the only kings in the TV era, like kings that actually ran the state, not just the head figure. But they fought against him. They fought against what was arguably the strongest communist regime in all of Africa, and they defeated that regime. This one dictator, with no support from the inside, took over all power in the country. They could have taken over him, hypothetically, if they wanted to use those guns. But the reason they couldn't is not because they were so weak or they didn't have enough ammunition, because that country, the only thing that's run down about it is the government. The military is weak. They still are using tanks from the 60s. Like, you could really take over. And most of the soldiers are forced soldiers. They don't want to fight. They would probably join you as soon as they saw a crowd of 100 people. They're like, well, this side looks stronger, let me go there. I agree with them. It's happened in situations like this before.
Yeah.
But the reason they can't is because he's locked down the country as a dictator. That's what dictators do. So I'm sure if America had a dictatorship, it would be even harder, because they have everything you could imagine. Think about, if just switch the same role of Eritrea but put it into America. A dictator who has the country on lock, essentially. Every block, every neighborhood has someone informing to him because he's paying them off, or they don't have to pay taxes. He'll give them something they can't resist. Every like mall strip, like let's say there's a nightclub. In that nightclub, every night there's like 4 or 5 guys just walking around trying to make you say something against the government. He literally, you can't go on the street. This is the crazy thing. In that country, if you were to drive on the street, and I forget what time it is, but there's a certain time where they raise and lower the flag. If you're driving at that time and you don't stop your car and get out and stand like and salute, or like if you're in the cafe in the main area and stand up when they're raising the flag at the government office, you should be worried. Could you imagine if everyone on Blanchard and Mackenzie stopped their cars and stood up whenever the parliament raised and lowered their flag, which let's say 6 a.m., 6 p.m.? That's how much of their fear he's instilled in the people. And they have guns. Everyone. And if you want means to ammunition, it's actually very possible there. It's very corrupt. You could get it if you wanted it.
Well, those are some fair arguments. I don't really
both sides. Yeah, both sides. I'm not trying to debate with you because I think we're both looking at it from side A and side B. But I just thought since you were carrying that side of the conversation, I'd bring the opposition argument. But I'm sure if we looked at it, we could probably find a situation where everyone had guns and they did overthrow the government. Eritrea did essentially too. You could argue that Eritrea overthrew the Ethiopian government because everyone had guns. Mm-hmm. But it's hard. I don't know. It is really conflicting, and that's why I think neither side has gotten very far in advancing anything in the last 10 years or so.
Well, no, and I mean, I think the pandemic has made things worse in the sense that it's really separated people. And I was watching a podcast the other day, and they were talking about how it was Jordan Peterson and Rex Murphy. They're having a conversation, and just how in Canada today and in the world, I mean, we don't break bread with people anymore, right? Like how we eat alone, we eat standing up, we eat while we're watching something on TV. Like if you sit with a crowd of if you sit around, like, and this is why I guess family reunions are such a contested issue, and a point of contention, is because it's like the one time a few times a year that you're forced, if you want to, you go along with the social convention, the obligation to get together with your blood family or whatever, and you're forced to sit at a table with people who you kind of disagree with potentially politically, like the classic brother and sister who are one's a registered Democrat, one's a registered Republican or conservative liberal or whatever, and there are some fireworks sometimes, but just the act of sitting and breaking bread with somebody, it just brings home that idea, that reminds us, I should say, that we're all human beings. Ultimately, I mean, Jordan Peterson and Rex Murphy sort of said that people are 90% the same. I think there's fairness to that. I think, we all want, good things for ourselves, good things for our children. We want to live in clean, healthy, safe communities. It's just that we have different ideas about how to get those things, right? And so that's why I really feel like during the pandemic, it's just made that worse. So when we have these very visceral, contentious issues, they're so polarized. And I think it would just be great to come back to a place of like, what, we can disagree on this piece or that piece, but fundamentally, we agree on this or disagree on that, or find some common ground. Because I think that's one key thing that has to happen. Otherwise, these issues just become, and both sides become more polarized, right? I mean, you have gun rights advocates, and there are some people, and it's a point worth debating, but I don't really feel like debating it. But that feel that there should be no limitations on the types of firearms that a private citizen can have. Like I have a friend who's a American Republican, and he feels that people should be able to have flamethrowers and grenade launchers and tanks if they want, right? And there's a case to be argued there, and there's a whole hour-long discussion there. But whereas on the other side, there are people who believe that, like my aunt, who is sort of more of a liberal intellectual, I could say, with her PhD education, and sort of has a different sort of slant and perspective of society, where firearms and guns are only really needed in the hands of police officers and military people, right? So there's, I mean, and so I feel like the two sides have really drifted apart, and the more that we keep yelling at each other over the fence, it just gets worse and worse, and we don't find that common ground, because I feel like there is a solution here. There really is a solution. It's just, how do we get there?
I think you're completely right, because that's just the name of the game in politics in general. Let's yell, let's yell. Hopefully I yell louder than they do and more people agree with my scream. And if they do, they'll vote for what I think. But let's be honest, that never works, because the louder you yell, the louder your opposition is going to yell back. And it's just, to use the analogy of yelling, one day you're going to lose your voice.
That's a fair point.
You know? But I had a question, though, from my perspective. In any legislation or law, don't you think if the majority of people agree with that there needs to be change with an old law, that the law should be looked at least, or at least there should be some kind of vote? And if the government doesn't allow for that for that thing to happen, then are they representing their people? Are they representing their population accurately? Because I saw some recent polling on abortion. Forget guns. We can get to that too. But abortion, the vast majority of America and liberal states, we all know, are pro-abortion, pro-abortion. And then in the Republican states, you'd be surprised. They're not as pro-life as you think, the general public. But the government are representing a side in those states, because they're right-wing states, that government they work for have kind of come to a consensus that that's what they're going to advocate for, like almost like salespeople. Like every branch, no matter who you're representing, has to do this. And the Democrats do it too. I'm just using this as an example. So how are they really representing their people if they don't even represent what the majority of their constituents want?
Good point. One thing that comes to mind immediately is there was this TED Talk, and it has like 10 million views. And the title was, and I didn't watch it, but it was "Why the Majority is Always Wrong." And I think there's something to be said for that. I do think that often the majority, because it kind of quashes, I mean, like if you lived in the US South during the Jim Crow era, the majority, as we understand it, was, tolerant, or say South Africa during apartheid, the majority was tolerant of certain behaviors. It's always been the minority, the Quakers, the Methodists, who helped, put together the Underground Railroad to Canada to help bring slaves out of the United States, or in South Africa, people like Nelson Mandela, who were exceptional because, they preached sort of a different way. Martin Luther King, sort of preached a different way to so I feel like the majority, because I myself have always felt like a minority in the way I think, because I really don't take hardline stances on things. I try and stay flexible, and I think a lot of people just take hard. So for me, when someone says the majority, I already sort of, I kind of, so there's something that, and then, you could say also right now, Justin Trudeau did not have the majority of the popular vote in the last election. I don't think he had, he didn't have, we know he didn't have the majority of the popular vote in the last election. And that was of the people who bothered to come out and vote too. And so just to say, like, so is it fair that, and even Joe Biden arguably in the United States doesn't have the majority. It's very close. I mean, it was like, I don't know.
He did have the majority, but it was just very slim.
Yeah. So it's just like, so if you want to take that track, do these people really have the majority, right? And then if they do have the majority, does the majority, how much stock do we put? Like, because I'm actually inclined more often or not to believe the minority, because I feel like the minority has thought of something in a different way, because it's too easy for groupthink. Groupthink is a real thing psychologically, and people go along with the herd, right? So that's one piece. So, but to your point about gun control in Canada, and let's do Roe v. Wade in a different episode. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
But to gun control, I did read some articles and I flagged them so I could look at them again later. But the majority of Canadians seem to feel it's not a huge majority. It's maybe in the 60%, 2/3 of Canadians feel that we should have more restrictions and more gun laws.
In a country that's already very restricted, though.
Yeah, but again, let's say for me, like, I'm not a firearms owner. I would like to become one at some point, and just to have one rifle or maybe one handgun. I don't know if that's allowed by the time I get around to it. But you know, I think as someone who was raised with more progressive values, and I'm sort of a non-violent pacifist person myself. I mean, unless, you know, it's my family or my community, or, you know, there's a foreign invader in a foreign country coming to, you know, do terrible things to us. I really don't see, like, I don't see how violence never fixes violence. Like, you just get more suffering and more violence and more. So to that point, um, I don't want to, like, you know, my wife made the point. She said guns represent violence, you know, because we see them in the context of violent movies. They're used in wars to kill people, and even in hunting, you know, hunting, it's a violent act to kill an animal. I mean, I'm, you know, and I'm not saying we shouldn't hunt, but so guns are an object that's associated with violence. So when these Canadians are polled, say, and again, I mean, how accurate are polls, right? Like, they're calling people, you know, at 7 o'clock. I worked for a polling company in Ottawa. I worked for a company that we did polls for third parties. And, you know, you're getting people at 7 o'clock in the evening, and you're asking them, like, you know, 20 questions, and then that's it, right? You don't know this person. They don't know you. Are their answers truthful? And I think for some people, I think for a lot of Canadians, and this is, I'm assuming, let's say, I'm making an assumption here, but I think a lot of Canadians who are opposed or to gun ownership or handgun ownership or want more restrictive laws, it's because they don't know guns, because they're scared of guns and things that we don't know we're afraid of, or that we're afraid of we don't know about, right? So if there was more general education and a general awareness amongst the average individual, like if those 60% of people in those polls who said, you know, who said that we should have more restrictive laws in Canada, what if you put them through a 2-week experience of, you know, working alongside, like taking the firearm safety course, seeing how restrictive our laws already are, seeing, you know, working with an actual gun, like how many people have actually shot a gun? You know, I've shot a gun a few times when I was younger, with junior forest wardens. It's like Boy Scouts. My stepdad was a firearm safety instructor. So that's the only experience I've had. But how many people have shot a gun? How many people have taken apart a gun and seen the mechanics that go into it? How many people have, you know, tried shooting a gun and seeing how difficult it is to actually hit a target? I mean, that's why I think a lot of these mass shooters pick these large events, because it is actually quite hard to hit something. I mean, it's not so easy, right? So I think there's an element of that there. I'd be interested to see the opinions of people who had spent, you know, what if they polled people after they'd gone through a 2 or 3 week training program or course and on guns and gun safety and gun culture in Canada, and had them spend some time with gun enthusiasts and go to the gun range, and then say what they think about that, you know? But,
Yeah, it's true. Can't deny what you said at all. I'm just trying to think here, because the issue I have with the whole thing is, one, you're right, we're not educated enough on guns. As a society, we fear them because they can kill you. But we don't fear cars, but cars technically can kill you. Here's the difference. The argument that gun advocates make, or yes, you're right, the car doesn't kill you though, it's the person driving the car. They have to direct the car to kill you. Same with guns. The gun itself didn't kill you. You had to shoot the gun to kill the person. Here's the thing. Guns were made to kill, cars were made to drive. That's one argument people have. But then a gun advocate will say, well, no, guns weren't made to kill, they were made to shoot. It doesn't have to be people. And then the other person will say, well, no, they'll go back and forth and they'll get in this deadlock. Well, here's my thing. If a gun was made to kill someone, and let's say we take away the government aspects to simplify the argument right now, like the whole point of militias and stuff. Let's say we take those guns away and we talk about the guns we have in Victoria right now, handguns, hunting rifles, our situation. Is there a way to restrict guns more without removing those guns? And I think yes. I think we just have to make stricter laws on how you get hands on a gun, stricter laws on the procedures, stricter laws on, I don't want to say guns in general, but stricter laws on how someone can obtain that gun. Because if you really want it, you can do the work and get it. But if you don't want to do that work, then you don't realize the seriousness of the weapon you're about to obtain. That's how I feel. In America, a lot of people disagree with me. A lot of people feel that if I want a gun as my Second Amendment right, I should be able to get one right now, tomorrow. Go to Walmart even. You can get some kinds of guns. But I think you can't get a driver's license tomorrow even. It takes a year in Victoria, in BC, at least if you're successful. So and why does something way more dangerous than a car take 2 seconds to get? Both of them can kill you. Not you could argue that it's the person killing you. Okay, but cars take a year and you only take one purchase to get a gun. That's kind of interesting, no?
Well, the firearm safety course in Canada is like I think it's the minimum is like 10 hours. Someone can fact check that, but I was speaking with the firearm safety instructor last week, and he actually says he goes above and beyond, and he makes sure that he spends probably 3 or 4 extra hours on it. So I feel like it's harder in Canada to get a gun than the United States.
In Canada, yeah, for sure.
It's not like you just walk up to the gun store and get it. And then when you do, if you buy it from a store, I was just reading today, in Canada, they actually have to like write down on a form that you purchased a gun from them, and that gets sent to the government. And then so there's like the 2 gun licenses. There's the PAL, the PAL, and the possession and acquisition license, and the restricted possession and acquisition license, the RPAL, and that's if you want a handgun, or I think for maybe semi-automatic weapons as well. But definitely for handguns, the RPAL. I'm not sure if it's for semi-automatics, but so for that different class of gun, it's a restricted license, and that's an extra day of training in a course, and you have to pass a test and exam. And then there is like a psychiatric assessment or something when you send off your paperwork. There's a piece of that there too. It's like they run your name, and this one guy was saying, as someone who has a restricted PAL, that the RCMP they have to give you notice, maybe 24 hours notice, but they can come and search your property at any time to see that to make sure that you're storing those guns safely. And the other thing is that they continually run those people's names through a database through criminal record checks. So if someone who has like a restricted PAL license, and they own a number of firearms, and they're arrested for assault and battery, or assault, or they're something comes up uttering threats, then they can have their guns taken away, right? So I feel like in Canada, and as you said before, because you did say this earlier on, like that the majority of gun owners in Canada are like something to this effect, law abiding, and they're licensed, right? So for me, this is my question, right? Like someone like me who wants to say get my firearm safety license and purchase a gun. If the government just keeps adding layer upon layer of bureaucracy and restrictions to it, it almost like discourages me from getting it, which some people say there's a bit of an agenda to that. I don't know. There seems to be a general climate of like, we don't really want gun owners in Canada. We don't want people don't need to own guns. You only need a gun if you're in the police or the military, right? There's that kind of attitude out there. And I feel like there's a bit of that kind of mentality is out there, or pushed maybe a little bit. I don't know.
Is that a wrong thing though? Sorry, I just wanted to, while you're going, I want you to add that. Do you think that might be helpful?
Well, for all the reasons that we talked about previously, I think that fundamentally, philosophically, I believe that citizens should have a check on government, but also for personal safety and security. I mean, let's be real here. In the last couple of years, if you needed an ambulance in Victoria, right, you're looking at like a 5-hour wait time. They're telling you to take a cab. Well, what about the police service? I mean, they're not really any different. What if you have a very busy Friday night, and you've only got, like, I went on a ride along once with Sanch Police. It was an awesome experience. And, we were like all over the place, and they only have a certain number of officers on at any given time. What if there is a home invasion? What if there is a burglar? I mean, the thing is, I think it sounds good. In fairness, I'm just arguing the other side for a second here. The number of times where a home invader is actually shot and killed, or is prevented from doing what they want to do, that number is probably smaller Because whenever there's a story like that, it gets really shared in the news, like as though it's an exceptional thing. I think in theory, we'd like to think that, if the police are busy and they can't get to us in time and I've got to save my family, I'm going to shoot and kill this person who's posing a threat to my family. But, did you get to your gun in time? If it was locked up in a cabinet in the basement where it's supposed to be, locked up safely, did you get to it in time? Or was it under your pillow or under your bed? And then if it's under your pillow or under your bed, maybe your 3-year-old picks it up one day and shoots somebody, right? So how often does it actually really pay off for what you want it for? But that's my thing, is like, and this is where I think conservatives and liberals differ somewhat, is that for most conservatives, I feel like there's some personality differences. And one common personality trait I notice amongst conservatives is this bent towards self-reliance and self-sufficiency. I don't want to rely on the police force. I don't want to rely on the state to take care of my needs, to take care of my family's security, to take care of my security. I want to take care of those things. I can take care of those things, right? So for them, they need a tool to do that. And that tool is a gun. Right. So I think that people should be allowed to own guns. It's just, again, for me, the murky area is to what degree, how much testing, as you say, and safety protocol should we go through to get that gun? Yes, driving lesson, you do a test. Some people do lessons, and the difference too between Canada and the United States, because you were talking about how you can't get a driver's license in a day. In the United States, with the Second Amendment, it specifically says, like, the right to bear arms. Like, that's the language that's used. It is a right. Whereas in Canada, it's a privilege to have a firearm. So there's a bit of a difference there too, right? Just like having a driver's license is a privilege, it's not a right. So, but I do believe that people should be able to own guns. I mean, and again, keep in mind too, I'm talking as somebody who's a city boy. I grew up in the city. I live in the city. If I lived out on a farm, right? I mean, how much more vulnerable would you feel if you lived out in a rural community? I mean, talk about a prime target for home invasion.
For
Like,
sure.
and I've read, some dark true crime stories where, 2 escaped felons will go out to some rural house and, like, there's no police around. And if they break in at 2 a.m, everybody's asleep, and, they get the family and they do whatever they want with them, and take whatever they want, and often leave them dead. And burn their house down on their way out. It's just like, so if I live in a rural community, apart from natural predators like wolves or coyotes or things like that, or mink, that might destroy, like, mink can destroy chickens. We knew a farmer here. He had, like, he's in my second interview, actually, my second episode. This mink destroyed like 30 chickens, and they don't even eat the meat. They just suck the blood out of these things and leave them there, right? So when you live on a farm, you need to have a firearm, I think, right? So it's just, I think people should be allowed to own guns in Canada, and I don't think we should be discouraged from it. It's just, how do we do it safely and responsibly? Yeah.
I completely agree with everything you just said. I have another question. And I'm just pressing on this one side, is because the way I like to look at it is, right now, the biggest conversation of this situation is in America, obviously. Right now, the situation there is you can't have guns, quite unrestricted. There is restrictions, but they're quite open relative to us. So what I try to do is I try to look at whoever's opposing that law, run through all their arguments, and if you can find a valid way to shut down all those arguments, then okay, maybe there's not a problem. But here's where I go with that now. Kids are dying in schools at the so-called safe place. The police aren't even helping sometimes. Like we saw in Uvalde, I think it is. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, that would be my guess. I've only read stories, so I haven't heard it pronounced, but yeah.
Sandy Hook, another great example. The famous Columbine school shooting, Virginia Tech, the list goes on. It's guaranteed now, almost in America, that a certain amount of people are going to die in a school. So at what point do we say enough is enough? The danger of guns is overtaken the right and the benefits. You understand what I'm saying? It's like, we can look at alcohol, for example. Alcohol causes a lot of bad things. But is it at the extent that they override the the joy of alcohol? Not really, because if there's two, let's say there's two drunk drivers in the week in Victoria, there might have been 50,000 people who drank that week, at least. Could be more, right? If you look at shootings, maybe you argue the same thing. But it's just crazy that one man in a DUI can crash his car and he can hurt himself and a few other people. But one man with a gun could literally kill 100 people in 2 minutes. Hypothetically, if he was a trained Navy SEAL marksman, did everything correctly, he lost his way and wanted to kill a bunch of people. Imagine 100 people stuck in a wedding reception room. You could mow them down with a gun so quickly, and you could do so much drastic bad, evil. It's just like, and I'm not saying that that's why guns have to go today. I'm just asking, if that is the case, when do we say enough is enough, or when do we say, okay, it's still okay?
Well, what does enough mean? You know what I mean? Like enough of what? Enough of guns?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Enough of guns, or enough of like human behavior that, because here's the thing, like if somebody wants to kill people, they're going to find a way to kill people. That's my argument. Like look at 9/11. No guns were used.
Yeah, but you know how hard that was to do?
I'm just saying, look at 9/11.
You're right.
If you want to kill people, you will find a way to kill people. I mean, there were the terrorist attacks in there was Toronto, there was the incel attack where the young man drove the van into people, right? I think he killed or injured 8 people. There was the one in France. And then we've also there was a famous case in Japan, and I'm going to put it in the description when I find the story, but it was something about this religious group. I think it was Shinto, but they, and I don't want to get the wrong one. Maybe it was Buddhist. I think it was Japanese Buddhist back in the late 90s. And they actually released cyanide in a subway and killed a bunch of people.
Well, and you're right.
So just to say, for me, yes, a gun makes it very easy to kill a lot of people, and you don't need a lot of training to do it, especially if you walk into a crowded high school cafeteria or wedding reception and just start shooting, right? But this is the thing that I think, and this is philosophically, I think we've actually come to the point here. This is really it. And this is where liberals and conservatives are so divided. To what extent are we willing to accept that freedom comes with a price? Freedom comes with a certain element of risk and danger.
That's what I was asking, essentially. I worded it very simply, but that is the point. What I'm saying is, at what point do we say, okay, we have too much freedom in this area, we need to restrict it? Because yeah, we're fully democratic, yeah, we're this, but it doesn't mean there's no restrictions to our lives. And I'll give you an example, since you brought up 9/11, and I'm glad you did. In 9/11, it was actually quite easy to do what they did at the time, considering how hard it is today. But it was still hard to organize that and do it perfectly. But there's a reason it's hard today, because airports are restricted, but no one's concerned with that. How come people aren't screaming that, oh, I can't even go visit my mom easily tomorrow, I could get turned away at the airport, because they're scared of a security threat? How come no one's screaming about that? Well, because it protects you, because the danger is so high.
People definitely complain about it. I
mean, like at a with legitimate voices in government. I've never heard a congressman in America or a parliamentary member in Canada say, we need to take less metal detectors down from the airport, and if someone looks suspicious, they should not be turned around. No, because at the end of the day, if that one person has to miss a meeting or be late at the expense of him potentially taking a whole plane down, nobody wants to take that risk.
This is where I'm in the minority. I kind of, and it's not to play devil's advocate, it really isn't, because we just went traveling recently and we were on a lot of planes. And, as I watched people being randomly selected to go into the body scanner, people who I don't think should have been going into a body scanner or need to, like a woman in her 30s with a baby in her arms, but hey, anybody could be a terrorist, right? But to me, I would rather, I'm like 80% in favor of this. Go back to metal utensils on airplanes. Relaxed, very relaxed security policies, and take my chances, because honestly, like, again, like, freedom, comes at a price. And do we really think that we can regulate and legislate everything to the point where we've, like, again, even with all the restrictions, we're probably still going to see the odd hostage taking of an airplane, the occasional downing of an airplane. It's just, people are going to find a way to do things that they want to do. I mean, it's just, and that's why for me, I'm willing to accept. I mean, death is a fact of life. We don't know how or when we're going to go, but it's a fact of life. And we live, I think we've gotten too comfortable with the idea that we can legislate and regulate everything to the point, like, flying is not fun. I mean, it used to be fun. Like, or I think it used to, you watch those videos from, like, movies set in the 50s, or the heyday of, like, Pan Am, these, like, jets setting around the world, and, like, you walk out onto the tarmac with your briefcase, nobody's looking at what you're carrying, you got metal cutlery to eat your food with. Like, it's just, what, and if a few planes, God forbid, I mean, I would hate to be on one of those. I don't know what I would do. It's easy to say it now, but so I just feel like freedom goes hand in hand with living life. And, we can't just, you know what I mean? Like, otherwise we should have a breathalyzer machine in every car. Before you drive, you have to blow a breathalyzer. Like how far do we want to go with this, right? Like, do we regulate and restrict everything, or do we just accept? Now, that being said, I haven't lost anyone to gun violence. Okay. I haven't had a gun pulled on me, right? At the same time, I still can't get away from the idea that that is that person, that is that individual. It's nothing to do with the gun. That is the means that they are using, but it's not, I can't just, and how are you going to get rid of 300 million guns in the United States? Like, how are you going to even go about doing that? Like,
no, those are all questions that I always ask myself. Like, let's say, even if they do it, how the heck are they going to do it successfully? So that I think is a point that no one can contest. Like, no one really has an answer to that.
Okay, let me just flip it around, because we've put me in the hot seat a little bit. So I'm just curious for yourself. Like, do you ever want to own a gun?
In Victoria?
Do you have the desire to own a firearm at any point in your life? I guess, I don't know.
I think it's real. I think I said something early on in the beginning. It's relative where I live.
Okay.
Because I feel I'm safe here, I don't.
That's fair.
Because but if I'm in a place where I'm not safe because of where the guns are, it's sad, but I have no choice. I have to. The only reason I'm getting it is because I'm not going to sacrifice my children and family in the future for my strong views on something, if that is how I feel.
Okay, so it's circumstantial. So gun ownership for you is relative to the situation that you're in.
For sure.
Okay.
But in Victoria, because other people don't have them, I don't need it. That's how I feel.
Okay.
And I know there are some people who do have them. But I know that they went through a process, and this happened and this happened. But let's say tomorrow someone does walk into my house and points a gun at me. Like you said, it's possible I could die that way. It's also possible I could die in a car accident. It's unfortunate, but I can flip it and say that at that point I can accept that fate because measures were taken to prevent it. But if I made a plane travel, for example, unrestricted, and the next thing I know, I'm about to fly into the CN Tower because some terrorists are taking over the plane, then I'm going to be like, damn, in my head, I really wish I didn't say that. And I'm sure I to throw it back at you, I'm sure, I know you said you would like a little less restriction, but I'm sure when that plane that you're in, if that happened, you're going to wish you didn't say that. When it's personal, we look at it objectively. But I think to do legislation and gun things and all these issues, we have to look at it personally sometimes too. It's not always objective. How would I feel if that was me?
Well, there's two other things here though, too, that I see. Is one is that what's good for me is good for you, right? We kind of, there's a bit of that we have in this day and age in society. And I don't personally, I don't think I'm like that. Like, I don't think that, like, let's say I didn't want to own a gun. It doesn't mean that I don't think other people should own guns. Like, everybody has different interests, right? Like I said, some people are car enthusiasts or poodle enthusiasts, or and that's great if your thing that you're enthusiastic about isn't associated with violence. But for some people, it's firearms and guns. Maybe it gives them a sense of power and control that they didn't have before, and they're reconciling some childhood issue or something. Who knows? But should people not be allowed to own guns and go hunting and go to the gun range just because, let's say I don't want to do that? Like, is that, like, to what extent do we limit other people's freedoms, or because we don't necessarily want something or feel that we need something, right? That's one piece. And I'm not saying that's you. I'm just saying that's one piece that's out there. Because like my aunt, she doesn't need a gun. She doesn't want a gun. So it's easy for her to say, the only people that need guns are police officers and military and the army, right? But, if you're actually, she doesn't hunt. She goes to the grocery store. Well, some people hunt, and we need people to hunt. It's, and I want to do another episode on that too, right? Like, what is the deer population like? Do we need some intervention? Do we need, and hunting is sort of a natural, it's done in the animal kingdom. We kill chickens to eat them. I mean, hunting is whether
we have advanced weapons to do it with because we're the advanced species. That's a good point.
But so there's that. And then the other thing is the criminal aspect of it, the illegal aspect of it. So again, I have to come back to this point because it still seems that and it's okay if we debate, honestly, but it still feels like, for you, just from what I'm hearing, it sounds a little bit like the restrictions are going to prevent instances where, because like, do you think that someone who is in organized crime or who is like a straight on gangster, from the hood, is going to go and take a weekend firearms course and buy it legally? They're not going to do that. Like, so if we have all these restrictions on guns, it's not actually going to stop that person. So that it comes back to that thing, like, how does that fix the problem if we have more restrictive, like, what I think the only thing that would really, okay, here's one fair point, is ammunition. Okay, I think it's in Switzerland. Ammunition is very restricted because Switzerland has high gun ownership. So if you restrict ammunition, but then again on the black market, and you have Mexico right on the border of the United States, where, no disrespect to Mexico, but a lot of people in the United States can get things from Mexico quite easily, right?
Well, even people move it quite easily, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, if bullets became restricted, then they could, like, the only thing that I really see as being a potential solution is to limit the number of guns, but then it puts the fault and blame on the gun, right? But it's what people do with the gun. And it's one thing that maybe as a society, we have to sacrifice guns and firearms for the greater good, because I can't guarantee that gun isn't going to end up in the hands of a criminal. And I shouldn't say criminal, no one is just a criminal. That gun shouldn't end up, I can't guarantee that gun isn't going to end up in the hands of someone who wants to use it to do bad things. Right.
I think that's a good way to word it too, for so many reasons.
But how do we do that? And is that even practical? And then should we even bother having the thought experiment about something like getting rid of all guns that isn't? And then again, is it fair to the people who are legitimately responsible and law-abiding gun owners? Is it fair to them to be that restrictive and to take guns away because of a few bad apples, right?
No, yeah. I think one thing I should say while we're doing this, just for the viewer's sake too, is that me and Adrien are not doing a thing where it's like he's saying, well, it's kind of look like you're taking the right wing side, I'm taking the left wing side. It's just, I opened up with a more left wing conversation. And I think what we're doing here is you're fact checking what I'm saying. You're saying, okay, that's a good point, but because there's this side, I'll mention it. And since you went off to that side, I think this is how conversation should be done in general for all things. I said something. Since you're here, you shouldn't just sit and agree with me. There's other sides. I know it too. So you have to bring that opposition into the conversation. And I think that's how we would find the solution to gun laws too. Instead of just saying the same 10 sentences over and over again, both sides just yelling it. No. Say something that directly affects the sentence I just said. I said something about planes and you explained about airport security. It's not like, I just think there's such an issue with gun laws in general, is there is a solution somehow. I don't know it, you don't know it. No one knows it right now, but because there's never really been some real work in some of these countries to actually find the solution. There's just been a lot of work in trying to advocate your political agenda through gun laws.
Well, I personally think, what we're doing is part of the solution.
Mhm.
I think that, again, just the pandemic and sort of the fragmentation of society in general, if someone has a mental breakdown and they have access to a firearm, right, they might use that, whether it's a legally owned firearm or not. If someone has, but let's switch the scenario around. Let's say someone has a mental breakdown or is going through some difficult stuff, and you know they're having weekly suppers with their neighbors or their community, or they're actively involved in a community, or they volunteer. This person who shot up, this individual who shot up the July 4th celebrations in Highland Park, I think it was called. If you read, I read about their story because I wanted to kind of get to know who is this, right? Like, what's the motive? And this person, from the articles I read, smoked a lot of marijuana, had a lot of issues with his parents and with sort of maybe with authority, sort of like there was definitely some like rebellious sentiment there.
Mhm.
And his dad had sort of, I mean, there's some bad parenting choices made there, like, and not to sound judgmental, but just when you're going to the police station to collect your son's knives that were seized from him in 2019 and saying that they're yours, and when you're the one who purchased the firearm for him as well, there were the police had to be called to his home in 2016 because he was suicidal and saying he was going to kill his family. So there were a lot of red flags there, right? So it makes me think that if something had been done on a personal level, on a societal level for this individual before that, had his parents sort of been different, had behaved differently, or had he been more involved in activities or in his community, right? Maybe this stuff could have been checked. So, and that's why it's so easy. Like, the end result is that this individual took a gun and killed people and took their lives and changed other people's lives forever. I mean, there's a police officer who has his hands over his eyes as he's walking away from the scene. And there's just like a baby stroller on its side and just looks like a complete chaos. And I mean, there's like trauma from that for people for the rest of their lives. And all because somebody had some mental health issues and chose to do this. And so, but at the end, so then what we do as a society is we seem to say, hey, guns, man, guns, we got to control guns. It's like, no. What about like coming back to community and like family and like respecting people's different opinions and not just like excommunicating them? And so I think fundamentally part of the solution lies in unifying as communities and as a society, and I think that's probably the solution to a lot of the problems that we have today.
Amen.
But that's my 2 cents. So anyway,
I agree.
yeah. All right.
Yeah, I think to kind of find a conclusion to this topic, because realistically, me and you could go on probably for 10 hours about this, plus if we had the time and the energy. But
That's the key.
it's just amazing to me that at the end of the day, yeah, a man used a gun to kill someone, and the gun was the prioritized weapon because it's the most effective weapon. So what that one sentence I just said right now agrees with both Republicans and Democrats in America. It agrees with both gun restrictors and gun advocates. But what they do tend to do is the advocates and the Republicans, or whoever you want to choose, will say the person killed the gun. And then the other side will say the gun killed the people. No, both of them did it together. So now we have to accept that both of us are right. So where do we move forward? That's the issue with this conversation. Nobody's wrong, in my opinion. I think you're both, me and you never really disagreed with each other. We just raised another argument that we both agreed with. You know what I'm saying? I didn't disagree with what you said about the airports. I just said, well, yeah, that's true. And I kind of believe it, but I don't know how I'd feel if I was in that situation. Now, maybe I'll regret it. It's just so much unsure thinking because it really hasn't been reviewed in the public space the way we're reviewing it right now, especially at the official level. So I think that's just, yeah, like there needs to be more communal gathering, sitting and talking between citizens, not always to political officials dictating everything. And that's kind of why I brought up the majority earlier. It wasn't specifically just about because they're the majority, it's because the majority comes from the people. And I think the people need more voices, even if it is the minority. the citizens need more voices and choices. If you really want to control government, I think more of the laws and things should be done by referendum. Why does everything have to, legislation have to be done by the governors or the MLAs? Why do they get to vote on everything? How come we can't vote on abortion? How come we can't vote on gun restriction? It's affecting us at the end of the day. They're the ones who have Secret Service walking around them all the time, right? I think we just as people need more power in the decision making, because we're the ones usually who have no agenda. We're just thinking about what's best for our parents and children and family, friends. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I think we've had a great discussion, and I will share this widely and encourage people to comment and to and if anyone wants to do a follow-up panel with Caleb and I on the subject, I think we'd both be welcome. We'd welcome that. So yeah. Well, thank you, Caleb. As always, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.